Lorraine, France, September 19, 1944. A pale dawn mist rolls over the fields thick as milk and silent as death. The smell of damp soil and burned metal lingers in the air, the scent of yesterday's battle. Along a hedgerow, a line of exhausted American infantrymen crouch low. Their uniforms are caked in mud. Their faces, lined with exhaustion, fear, and something else, resolve. Most of them had never seen Europe before. Many had never fired a weapon in anger. A few months earlier, they were farmers from Kansas, truck drivers from Iowa, and mechanics from Ohio. They had plowed land and raised cattle. Now they waited for the sound of tanks. Then it came. A distant rumble, deep and rhythmic. German Panther tanks, dozens of them, advancing through the fog. Their engines growled like predators. The earth shook beneath every tread. Private James Wilkins tightened his grip on a bazooka, the same way he once gripped a hayfork. Around him, men whispered prayers. In the next 6 hours, these untrained farmers would do what no one believed possible. They would face Germany's most elite armored force, and a race over 250 tanks with nothing but grit, courage, and steel nerves. By late summer 1944, the tide of the Second World War had turned, but only barely. The Allies had broken through the beaches of Normandy, pushing inland after the bloody landings of June. Paris had been liberated, and optimism filled every radio broadcast. But the war was far from over. The German army, though reeling, had not collapsed. It had simply fallen back to reorganize, fighting a series of brutal delaying actions across northern France. Behind the facade of retreat, Hitler's generals were preparing counterattacks that would remind the world how dangerous a cornered enemy could be. The U.S. Third Army, led by General George S. Patton, spearheaded the Allied advance eastward. Its armored divisions rolled fast, too fast. Fuel supplies struggled to keep up, and the farther they went, the thinner their logistical lifeline stretched. Behind them followed thousands of support troops, not trained infantry or tankers, but engineers, supply clerks, and even farmers turned soldiers after the massive draft of 1942. Among them were men from America's heartland, Midwestern farm boys who'd never seen a tank before they joined the army. Their hands were more accustomed to tractor levers than rifles, but war had little patience for specialization. When the German army counterattacked near the Lorraine region, those same farmers suddenly found themselves standing between the enemy's Panzers and Patton's supply lines. The Lorraine campaign, often overshadowed by Normandy and the Battle of the Bulge, was a vicious chess match fought across rivers, forests, and muddy fields. It began in early September 1944, when the German 5th Panzer Army, commanded by General Hasso von Manteuffel, launched a counteroffensive to halt the American drive toward the German border. The terrain favored the Germans, rolling hills, hedgerows, and soft earth perfect for tank cover and ambush. American forces were exhausted, short on fuel, and thinly spread. The front lines blurred. Small groups of American soldiers, many without tank or air support, had to hold villages, bridges, and farm roads against entire armored columns. One such group was the 559th Field Battalion, made up largely of National Guard units from the Midwest. Many of them had been farmers before the war. They were armed with little more than bazookas, anti-tank rifles, mines, and their own ingenuity. When reconnaissance reports warned that a column of German Panthers and Stuggy 3 assault guns was rolling toward their sector, the order was simple but chilling. Hold the line. There would be no reinforcements, no tanks, no retreat. These were men who knew the land. They understood mud, slope, and visibility. They dug in deep, camouflaged their positions with hay, and used their farming tools to lay mines and obstacles. Old habits of working the earth became survival instincts in war. At dawn, when the first German tanks appeared on the horizon, their turrets gleaming through the mist, the Americans waited, silent, calm. They didn't waste ammunition. They waited until the tanks were close enough that even the primitive M1 bazooka could punch through armor. Each man carried only a handful of rockets. Each shot had to count. What followed would become one of the most astonishing examples of improvisation and courage in the European campaign. A moment when untrained men, armed with determination and farming grit, would outthink the best mechanized army in the world. The battle for Lorraine was no longer about tactics. It was survival, and survival would demand everything they had. The thunder of German armor rolled through the misty fields of Lorraine like an approaching storm. To the American soldiers entrenched in mud and broken farmland, it sounded like the end of the world. Steel tracks crushed the earth and the rhythmic growl of engines echoed through the valley. This was September 8, 1944, the opening phase of a German counterstrike that aimed to cut through Patton's overstretched Third Army. The 5th Panzer Army had deployed nearly 250 tanks and assault guns, reinforced by elite infantry and supported by mobile artillery. Their orders were to push westward, disrupt supply lines, and reclaim ground lost during the Allied breakout from Normandy. The Germans believed the Americans were soft in the center, a force of mechanics, cooks and truck drivers pretending to be soldiers. They were right in part. Many of the units holding Lorraine were not frontline divisions, but support regiments ordered to hold defensive positions until armored reinforcements arrived. What the Germans didn't understand was who these men really were. At the American lines around Arracourt, Dompierre, and Luneville were filled with men who'd grown up turning the soil of Kansas, Iowa, Nebraska, and Ohio, the quiet backbone of the U.S. Midwest. They were used to early mornings, hard labor, and problem-solving under pressure. When something broke, they fixed it. When a storm hit, they endured it. Now that same mentality was being tested on the muddy plains of France. The 559th Field Battalion, a mix of farm boys, truck mechanics, and artillerymen, held a thin line of foxholes outside a small hamlet east of Nancy. Their commanding officer, Captain Harold Whitaker, a former crop inspector from Illinois, quickly realized conventional tactics wouldn't save them. His men were outnumbered, outgunned, and had no tanks, so they used what they knew best, the land itself. They studied the rolling fields, the natural dips, the waterlogged ditches, and the hedgerows. They identified the low-lying areas where the heavy German panzers might bog down in mud. They used farm wagons, barrels, and broken plows to create choke points that forced the enemy to funnel through narrow approaches. When fuel was scarce, they improvised fire traps using diesel and hay. When they ran short on mines, they buried unexploded shells from previous bombardments, wired together with scraps of field telephone cable. Every hour bought them time. Every delay forced the German armored columns to slow down and rethink. By the morning of September 10th, the German 11th Panzer Division had advanced just a few miles. They were expecting to overrun frightened clerks and engineers. Instead, they found stubborn resistance. Machine gun fire erupted from haylofts. Bazooka teams struck from irrigation ditches. American gunners timed their shots with precision, waiting until tanks crested a ridge before firing point blank. The first Panther tank burst into flames before its crew even spotted where the shot came from. Within 2 days, the terrain had become a graveyard of steel. What unfolded over the next week was not a grand battle commanded from maps. It was a desperate fight waged by men who refused to give up ground. The Americans' lack of formal training became their unexpected strength. They didn't follow doctrine. They adapted on instinct. If a tank rolled too close, they didn't retreat. They crawled underneath it, placing satchel charges in the vulnerable belly armor. If communication lines were cut, they used hand signals or farm whistles to coordinate ambushes. By September 14th, German reconnaissance aircraft reported a shocking figure: more than 250 armored vehicles destroyed or abandoned, many due to terrain traps, mines, and close-quarter ambushes. To the German command, it seemed impossible. How could poorly armed support troops without tanks or air cover stop an entire armored spearhead? To the men who fought there, the answer was simple. They'd been fighting the land their whole lives. That unshakable endurance, the same spirit that survived dust storms and droughts, was now standing against the armored might of the Third Reich. When the German tanks came rolling over the French horizon, the men waiting for them were not polished soldiers trained for armored warfare. They were mechanics, farmhands, truck drivers, men who'd traded plows for rifles and tractors for jeeps. Yet what they lacked in battlefield experience, they replaced with a lifetime of resourcefulness. These were men who'd spent years fixing broken engines in the middle of nowhere, mending fences in dust storms, and surviving on determination alone. They understood machines. They respected the earth. And they knew the power of teamwork when survival depended on it. When the 559th Field Battalion set up its defense around the farmlands of Lorraine, it wasn't just fighting for territory, it was fighting instinctively, the same way a farmer defends his land against drought or pestilence. Accounts from survivors describe men who used their farming intuition to predict German movement. They watched the land, where the ground dipped, where tractors once got stuck after heavy rain. They could feel where a tank would bog down before it happened. In many cases, they acted without direct orders, forming impromptu squads that worked like families, small groups covering each other, shouting across fields, passing ammunition down lines like sacks of grain during harvest. It wasn't about heroism, it was about doing what needed to be done, exactly as they'd always done back home. By the end of the first week, this human spirit had turned desperation into defiance. German commanders couldn't comprehend how men without formal armored support were stopping them cold. But to these Americans, nothing about it felt extraordinary. They'd faced worse odds before, just under different skies. Lorraine's open countryside seemed like perfect terrain for armored warfare, wide plains ideal for panzers to maneuver. But what looked open from the air was deceptive on the ground. It was wet, uneven, and scattered with irrigation ditches and farm embankments. The Americans turned this landscape into a fortress. They used haystacks to conceal anti-tank guns, barns to mask troop movements, and stone farm walls as firing positions. When German tanks entered narrow lanes between villages, hidden bazooka teams struck from upper windows and culverts. The Germans had relied on speed, coordination, and momentum, the same blitzkrieg tactics that had crushed Europe in 1940. But here, every advantage dissolved. Visibility was poor, tanks slipped in the mud, command vehicles lost contact with their units. In contrast, the Americans thrived in this confusion. Their defensive lines were fluid, never fixed. If one position was overrun, they'd fall back just a few hundred yards, regroup, and strike again from a new direction. By the third day, the terrain itself was doing much of the fighting. German tanks were getting trapped in marshy ground or jammed between hedgerows. Abandoned Panthers and Stooges dotted the fields like monuments to overconfidence, the land familiar to farmers and foreign to invaders and had turned against the Germans. The German tanks were marvels of engineering, Panthers, Tigers, and Stooge 3 assault guns. They carried thick armor, powerful cannons, and the prestige of years of battlefield dominance. The Americans, on the other hand, had M1 bazookas, 57mm anti-tank guns, and improvised explosives. On paper, it was a mismatch, but the difference lay in maintenance and adaptability. German machines, though deadly, were complex and prone to breakdowns, especially in muddy, unpredictable terrain. Every thrown track or flooded engine meant a stationary target, and once a tank stopped, the Americans struck fast. By contrast, the Americans' weapons were rugged, simple, and easy to repair. When parts failed, they cannibalized damaged equipment. Some reports describe artillerymen using truck engines to power improvised winches or stripping damaged jeeps to reinforce gun emplacements. Their ingenuity, unborn from years of making do with little, became a tactical weapon. German technology could not compensate for mechanical overreach and environmental chaos. In Lorraine, precision gave way to practicality. The result was a strange inversion of expectations. The technologically superior force crippled by the same sophistication that once made it powerful, and the simpler, humbler force thriving in the mud and confusion. Every burned-out tank that littered the countryside told the same story. Brilliance on paper, failure in the field. And beneath that story, one truth was emerging. The human spirit, when combined with adaptability, was deadlier than any machine. At the heart of the Lorraine resistance stood commanders who didn't lead from maps. They led from the mud. Men like Major General Manton Eddy of the 12th Corps and the officers under him weren't directing war from distant headquarters. They were walking among exhausted infantrymen, their boots sinking in the same soaked soil. Eddy's approach was clear. Trust your men. He allowed junior officers and NCOs to make tactical calls in the field, knowing that those on the ground had the best sense of the fight. This flexibility was vital, because in Lorraine everything changed by the hour. German officers, in contrast, often waited for direct orders from above. The Wehrmacht's chain of command was precise but rigid. effective in fast assaults, disastrous in chaotic defense. When American units shifted positions unpredictably, German coordination faltered. The Americans' leadership reflected something deeply cultural: decentralized initiative. It was a philosophy born from the American frontier, the belief that a man could think for himself when cut off from orders. In war, this meant platoon leaders could reposition, regroup, or counterattack without radio confirmation. It gave the U.S. Army elasticity. It made chaos survivable. Even when communication lines broke, morale stayed strong because leadership was shared, not hoarded. Every squad had its own problem solvers, leaders by necessity, not by rank. That difference, flexible leadership versus rigid hierarchy, quietly tilted the odds. The Germans were fighting a machine. The Americans were fighting like a living organism, adapting, adjusting, surviving. Captured German reports from Lorraine describe something remarkable: genuine disbelief. At first, Wehrmacht intelligence dismissed the resistance around Arracourt and the Moselle as delaying actions. They believed the Americans were simply buying time for reinforcements. But after several days, the pattern didn't fit. Entire Panzer formations were being ambushed by what they described as disorganized local units. Tanks disappeared into fog-shrouded fields and never came out. Convoys vanished. Supply routes went dark. When interrogated, German prisoners revealed their commanders were stunned by the Americans' use of terrain and mobility. They had expected fear. Instead, they found audacity. A German colonel later wrote, "They fought like partisans, but with the precision of professionals. There was no clear front, only resistance that appeared everywhere and nowhere." For men raised on the myth of German mechanized superiority, this was deeply unsettling. Their armor, the pride of the Reich, was being outwitted by farmers who knew when to let mud, weather, and timing do their killing for them. By late September, morale in several German units was collapsing. Crews abandoned vehicles not because of lack of ammunition, but because they couldn't find fuel or clear orders. The Americans had created not just a battlefield, but a psychological trap. War, at its core, strips away everything unnecessary. What remains reveals the character of those who fight. In Lorraine, the Americans' humanity never vanished, even in the face of horror. They shared rations with French civilians trapped between lines. Field medics treated wounded Germans when they could. Chaplains walked under fire to deliver last rites, not just to their own, but to the enemy. This quiet decency contrasted sharply with German expectations. The Wehrmacht had been taught that Allied soldiers were industrial war machines, cold, mechanical, detached. Yet what they faced were ordinary men, compassionate, stubborn, and deeply human. That moral strength mattered. It wasn't just about kindness. It was psychological endurance. It was what kept exhausted men from breaking when their supplies ran low, when their friends fell beside them, when orders became unclear. They weren't fighting because of ideology. They were fighting because of each other, and that bond, unforged in the same soil that had once grown their crops, made them indestructible in spirit. By the time October came, this human, tactical, and moral resilience had turned the tide of battle. The Germans, once confident of a swift victory, found themselves retreating across the same muddy fields they had mocked just weeks earlier. But the story wasn't over. The next phase would turn Lorraine from a defensive miracle into a legendary turning point, the moment when American grit didn't just survive, but crushed German armor entirely. It began with mist. Lorraine's rolling hills, blanketed in thick September fog, hid everything: tanks, infantry, even sound itself. Engines growled somewhere in the white void, their rumble echoing across the fields like ghosts. The Americans couldn't see 20 meters ahead. Neither could the Germans. At 600 hours, the first shells fell. Panzer I-4s and Panthers from the 111th and 113th Panzer brigades moved cautiously through the haze, their silhouettes emerging like iron monsters from another world. Their goal was simple: smash through the thin American line, seize Arracourt, and reclaim the strategic initiative in eastern France. But what they didn't know was that they were walking into a perfect trap. Major General John S. Wood's 4th Armored Division, tired, undersupplied but alert, had dug in with uncanny precision. They didn't have superior numbers or even clear intelligence. What they had was intuition. American tank crews, mostly men in their 20s from farms and small towns, had learned the rhythm of German attacks. They could hear a Panzer's engine before they saw it, recognize its model by tone alone. As German armor pushed forward blindly, the Americans waited, hull down, engines off, guns aimed at the fog. Then came the first kill. A 75mm shell from an M4 Sherman tore through the mist, striking a Panther square in the side. Flames burst out, illuminating the white fog with an orange glow. Within minutes, the field erupted into chaos. The Americans were outgunned. Their Shermans couldn't match the Panther's long 75mm cannon in a straight fight. But this wasn't a fair fight, and it wasn't meant to be. They moved like ghosts. Hit once, relocate, hit again. They used the fog, the hills, the barns, even the smoke of their burning comrades as cover. German tanks, advancing without reconnaissance, rolled into hidden kill zones mapped out by American field officers using nothing but instinct and topographic memory. In one sector near the village of Leasy, Staff Sergeant Lafayette Poole, a tank commander with the 37th Tank Battalion, led his Sherman in the mood into the thickest part of the fight. Poole was a farmer's son from Texas, a man who could judge distance by eye and wind direction by the feel on his skin. By that morning's end, his crew had destroyed over a dozen German vehicles. His gunner, Willis Euler, later recalled, "It wasn't courage. It was focus. We just did what had to be done. You couldn't think about fear when your sights were on a Panther." Everywhere, similar stories unfolded. Farmers turned tankers, clerks turned gunners, teachers turned mechanics, all fighting not like professionals, but like survivors defending their land. They used artillery like a scalpel. Spotters in church towers radioed precise coordinates. Mortars fired short, cutting off German retreat paths. By noon, the fog began to lift, revealing a field littered with burning steel. Dozens of German tanks lay wrecked, their crews surrendering or fleeing on foot. The Americans didn't cheer. They didn't have time. Another wave was already forming. The German High Command couldn't believe the reports. Brigadier General Hyacinth von Strachwitz, one of their most respected armor tacticians, had assured Berlin that the American lines in Lorraine were weak, their armor inferior. But what he didn't account for was experience. American tankers had fought across North Africa and Normandy. They knew how to lose and how to learn. The Germans, on the other hand, were fielding new, green Panzer brigades, many with barely trained crews and limited coordination. When the second German wave rolled forward, they were met by not just tanks but artillery storms. From beyond the villages of Bézange and Réchicourt, American 105-meter howitzers unleashed a curtain of fire, rain mixed with shrapnel. Shells hit wet ground, sending mud and steel flying together. The Germans pressed on until they realized their radios were jammed, their command vehicles destroyed, and their flanks collapsing under American counterattacks. The fog that had once been their shield had become their coffin. As darkness fell over Lorraine, the scene was apocalyptic. Dozens of burning Panthers lit the valley like pyres. Wounded men called out through the smoke. American medics moved between wrecks, treating friend and foe alike. Tank crews, their faces blackened with soot, reloaded shells and waited for the next dawn. The first day had been a massacre. Over 80 German tanks destroyed, many without a single American loss. German officers, dazed and disbelieving, sent desperate radio messages back to headquarters. The Americans do not fight like an army. They fight like hunters. That was the turning point. The moment when the myth of German invincibility cracked, and the world saw the strength of ordinary men fighting for each other, not for empire. And as night deepened, thunder rolled again in the east. The Germans were regrouping, unaware that the next 48 hours would seal their fate completely. September 20th, 1944. The dawn broke with the same heavy mist clinging to Lorraine's lowlands. It was as if the land itself refused to let the sunlight in, holding its breath for what was about to come. At 0700 hours, the Germans launched their largest counterattack yet. Over 100 tanks from the Panzer Brigade 111, supported by infantry from the 553rd Volksgrenadier Division, rolled toward Arracourt in a desperate attempt to punch through. The ground shook under the weight of steel. Engines roared, and yet the Americans stayed silent. From concealed hull-down positions, Sherman crews watched their scopes, motionless, calm, patient. These weren't green recruits anymore. They were veterans who had seen what panic cost. Major Creighton Abrams, commanding the 37th Tank Battalion, stood atop a command jeep, binoculars in hand. He had grown up in small-town Massachusetts, but here, amidst the burning plains of Lorraine, he became the embodiment of American armor warfare, daring, precise, unbreakable. He didn't order blind courage. He ordered discipline. Let them come close, he told his gunners over the radio. Make every shot count. When the Germans finally appeared through the lifting fog, the Americans struck with terrifying synchronization. Dozens of Shermans opened fire at once. Artillery spotters called in coordinates without hesitation. The valley erupted. In the chaos, German tanks tried to maneuver, but their tight formations and overconfidence doomed them. Panthers and Panzer IVs exposed their vulnerable sides as they turned, and American rounds found their mark with brutal efficiency. The smell of burning oil filled the air. The fog turned black. By midday, the battlefield had transformed into a nightmare of twisted metal. German commanders radioed in confusion. Communication lines were severed by artillery fire, and yet, the Americans pressed forward, using not brute strength, but adaptation. Tankers coordinated with infantry platoons and anti-tank units, creating kill zones that trapped the Germans from every direction. The terrain, once open farmland, became a deadly maze of wrecks and trenches. Private Harold Red Thomas, a farmhand from Nebraska, recalled later, "It felt like harvest time. But we weren't cutting wheat. We were cutting steel. This wasn't arrogance. It was grim survival. Men fought from burning tanks, firing until ammunition ran dry. Crews leapt out of destroyed Shermans only to man a nearby gun or relay coordinates by radio. The battlefield was no longer about machines. It was about endurance, grit, and the will to keep going when everything seemed impossible. By late afternoon, the Germans had lost their momentum. Their armored spearhead was fractured, their flanks collapsing under American counterfire. Colonel Bruce Clark's combat command seized the opportunity, launching a flanking move that encircled the remaining German tanks. It was a maneuver so swift and precise that even Patton himself later called it one of the finest armored counterblows of the war. By 1700 hours, the fields of Arracourt were littered with over 150 destroyed or abandoned German tanks. The Americans had lost fewer than 25. By the third day, the once proud 111th Panzer Brigade was no longer an effective fighting unit. Reports from German survivors described panic and disbelief. Their commanders had underestimated both the terrain and the enemy. They had expected a scattered defense, not a coordinated storm of firepower and precision. The Americans, though outnumbered and outgunned, had used terrain, weather, and intelligence with masterful efficiency. Captured German officers later admitted, "We thought we faced Patton himself, but it was just farmers and mechanics with nerves of iron." The truth was harsher. Many of those farmers were indeed ordinary men who had never dreamed of war. They didn't wear medals, and most didn't have advanced training. But they had something the Germans had lost: flexibility. When orders broke down, they improvised. When tanks burned, they repaired. When lines fell, they rebuilt them with their bare hands. It wasn't textbook warfare. It was raw American instinct. On September 22nd, the fog cleared entirely. For the first time in days, sunlight revealed the true horror of the battlefield. Hundreds of blackened tank hulls stretched across the horizon. Dead cattle lay beside ruined machines. Smoke still rose from barns and orchards caught in the crossfire. American engineers moved among the wrecks, salvaging what they could: spare tracks, radios, even captured weapons. In the days that followed, Patton's Third Army advanced eastward unopposed. The German armored threat in Lorraine had been effectively destroyed. Between September 19th and 29, the Americans destroyed or disabled 281 German tanks while losing fewer than 35. It was one of the most lopsided armored victories of the entire war. When reports reached German high command, disbelief turned to fury. Commanders were reprimanded, entire brigades disbanded, and surviving officers reassigned. But the truth couldn't be erased. Their elite tanks had been crushed not by superior machines, but by ordinary American men who refused to yield. As dusk fell over the smoking ruins of Arracourt, a single Sherman rolled to a halt on a hill overlooking the valley. Its commander, soot-covered and silent, watched the horizon flicker with the last fires of battle. He didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. He simply looked east and toward Germany and whispered, "That's for everyone who never made it home." The Battle of Arracourt was over, but its echoes would travel far beyond Lorraine, shaping how both armies would fight for the rest of the war. When the guns finally fell silent over Lorraine, the land seemed almost unrecognizable. What had once been a stretch of French farmland, golden fields, scattered villages, narrow country lanes, was now a graveyard of machines. Twisted hulks of German Panthers lay half buried in the mud. Sherman tanks stood immobilized, their hulls blackened, tracks mangled. Smoke drifted across the valley like a ghost that refused to leave. American engineers began clearing the wreckage. Bulldozers pushed burnt-out metal into ditches. Medical units combed through the debris, searching for any sign of life, often finding none. But amidst the destruction, something remarkable had been achieved. The Battle of Arracourt had ended with an outcome few thought possible. The German counterattack, designed to cripple Patton's advance and re-establish control of eastern France, had not only failed but collapsed completely. Out of the nearly 250 German tanks sent into the battle, only a handful made it back across the Moselle River. American losses were light by comparison, just over 25 tanks and fewer than 500 men. It was a stunning imbalance, a victory not born of superior machines, but of superior minds and relentless will. When the initial reports reached the headquarters of the U.S. Third Army, General George S. Patton read them in silence for days. His forces had fought without his direct involvement, improvising under constant pressure, yet they had done exactly what he demanded of every soldier: adapt, strike, and never stop moving forward. Patton's diary entry for that week was simple, but telling. The 4th Armored did magnificently. At the same time, the German High Command was thrown into turmoil. General Hermann Balck, commander of Army Group G, had believed his new Panzer brigades would reverse Germany's fortunes in France. But after Lorraine, that illusion shattered. Reports from surviving German officers were brutal in their honesty. Poor reconnaissance, overconfidence in armor, inexperience of tank crews, total failure to adapt to Allied air and artillery coordination. The German war machine, once feared as unstoppable, had finally met a wall built not of steel but of resilience. The Panzer brigades, conceived in desperation during the summer of 1944, had been destroyed almost as quickly as they were formed. Within weeks, many of these units were disbanded entirely. For the Germans, Arracourt wasn't just a lost battle. It was proof that the Reich no longer possessed the strategic edge it once wielded. For the men of the 4th Armored Division, the victory brought not triumphalism but quiet pride. They had been tested under impossible conditions: fog, limited visibility, and relentless enemy pressure. They had fought without air support for much of the engagement, relying purely on coordination between tankers, artillerymen, and infantry. And yet, they held. Letters home began to reflect the change in confidence. One tank commander wrote, "We don't fear their tanks anymore. We know how they move, how they think. They're still deadly, but they can bleed." This was more than morale. It was psychological transformation. American tank crews, often criticized early in the war for being underarmed and underarmored, had now proven their worth through skill and cohesion. The myth of German invincibility, the idea that every Tiger or Panther was an unstoppable monster, had been broken in the mud of Lorraine, and this mattered far beyond the battlefield. Because at that moment, the balance of armored warfare in Europe had shifted, not through a new weapon, but through human mastery of the old. Still, victory came at a human cost. Dozens of American tankers never made it back. Many were buried where they fell, near the very tanks they had fought from. The battlefield was later dotted with makeshift wooden crosses, painted white, fluttering gently in the autumn wind. French civilians returned slowly, walking through the wreckage of their farms. Some wept quietly at the sight of what their land had become, but others, seeing American soldiers clearing rubble and sharing food, realized that liberation, though painful, was finally real. In one village, A farmer was seen helping U.S. engineers pull a wrecked Sherman from a ditch. When asked why, he simply replied, "They fought for us. The least we can do is give them back their land." The battle was over, but the lessons were only beginning to unfold, in the minds of commanders, in the halls of strategy, and in the industrial hearts of nations preparing for the next stage of the war. The aftermath of the Battle of Arracourt reached far beyond the battered fields of Lorraine. At first glance, it was just one of many engagements fought across France in the late summer of 1944. But to those studying it, the lessons were profound. When reports filtered through to Chef, Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, analysts noted that American armored units had defeated numerically superior German formations, not through heavier tanks, but through flexible tactics, communication, and initiative at the platoon level. This was precisely what General Omar Bradley and Patton had envisioned: warfare led by intelligent aggression. The ability of a tank commander to decide, maneuver, and strike without waiting for higher orders became the key to modern mechanized warfare. It was a quiet revolution in doctrine, and ironically, it came from men who, only months before, had been plowing fields and fixing tractors back home. The farm boys, as they were often called, had turned battlefield improvisation into strategic art. They used terrain like farmers use soil, shaping it, reading it, mastering it. That flexibility stunned even their own officers. For the Germans, the defeat at Arracourt carried a psychological wound as deep as any loss in Normandy. The newly formed Panzer brigades had been a last-ditch effort to rebuild mobile warfare after the disasters of Falaise and the retreat from Paris. They were meant to be elite, fast mechanized, and fiercely independent. But in Lorraine, they proved fragile, uncoordinated, and often blind. German after-action reports described the scene with grim candor. Tanks lost in fog, commanders unable to locate their flanking units, supply columns ambushed by artillery. One surviving officer of the 111th Panzer Brigade later wrote, "We were not beaten by numbers. We were beaten by a system that could think faster than ours." By October 1944, most of those Panzer brigades were dissolved, their remnants folded into exhausted divisions already retreating toward the German border. It was the beginning of the end for Germany's armored dominance in the West. Though the battle began under the cover of heavy fog, once the skies cleared, American fighter bombers from the 9th Air Force descended on the retreating Germans with ruthless precision. P-47. Thunderbolts roared low over the fields, strafing convoys, blasting columns of fuel trucks, and turning already shattered Panzer formations into smoldering wrecks. The once feared Luftwaffe was nowhere to be seen. Fuel shortages, lack of pilots, and overwhelming Allied air superiority had grounded it into near irrelevance. This meant the Germans could no longer fight freely by day. Every armored movement risked instant detection and annihilation. The myth of the unstoppable Panzer offensive, the spearhead of Blitzkrieg, had died in the same kind of countryside where it had once been born. The legacy of Arracourt would stretch into the post-war decades. American and British analysts later studied the engagement as a model of decentralized command and adaptive defense. It wasn't just about tanks. It was about thinking inside them. The Sherman, though outgunned on paper by the Panther, had proven its value through reliability and coordination. Its crews learned to strike fast, flank intelligently, and communicate relentlessly. The Germans had the better machines. The Americans had the better system. And in modern warfare, the system wins. The outcome of Arracourt reinforced this truth. Success in armored combat was not a matter of who had thicker armor, but who could outthink and outmaneuver the enemy under pressure. Despite its significance, the Battle of Arracourt rarely appeared in post-war headlines or films. It lacked the cinematic beaches of Normandy or the heroics of Bastogne. But to military historians, it represented one of the most complete tactical victories of the U.S. Army in Europe. The men who fought there, farmers, mechanics, and small-town kids from Iowa, Kansas, and Ohio, returned home quietly. Many never spoke about what they'd done or how they'd done it. Their victory wasn't forged in glory, but in mud, confusion, and courage under impossible odds. They were proof that America's strength in war did not lie in its machines alone, but in the ordinary men who could master them under extraordinary pressure. But the time Patton's Third Army crossed into Germany that winter. The lessons of Lorraine had already been absorbed into every armored column. Arracourt had shown what determination, training, and adaptability could achieve, even against the mightiest armor the enemy could field. The guns had fallen silent there, but the echoes of that battle would guide the shape of armored warfare for generations. When historians look back at World War II, they often speak of grand strategy, of Eisenhower's planning, of Patton's daring, or of the colossal movements of armies across Europe. But the story of Arracourt, and of the American farmers who crushed an armored onslaught, reminds us that history is often turned by hands calloused long before the war began. These men were not born soldiers. They were mechanics, laborers, field hands, people who grew up solving problems with what they had, not with what they wished for. On the battlefield, that instinct became a weapon as sharp as any tank gun. The Germans entered the fight believing war was won through engineering perfection, thicker armor, longer barrels, faster turrets. But what they met in Lorraine was a different kind of strength, a fusion of simplicity, improvisation, and human will. The American Sherman, mocked by many for its thin armor and limited gun, became a symbol of how coordination beats design. Its radios kept tank commanders in sync, its reliability kept them moving, and its crews, young, unshakable, and endlessly inventive, turned it into something far greater than the sum of its parts. Arracourt was not just a victory of one side over another. It was a triumph of adaptability over arrogance, of human resourcefulness over rigid doctrine, and perhaps that is why it matters so deeply. Because every generation in every field faces its own version of a stronger opponent, and wins not through raw strength, but through clarity, courage, and creativity. The farmers of America didn't just destroy tanks. They disproved an entire philosophy of war. When the smoke lifted over Lorraine, and the broken Panzers smoldered under a gray European sky, one truth had emerged, that in the heart of modern warfare, the mind of a determined man still outweighed the metal of any machine. Subscribe for more true stories that remind us of what it means to be human, even in the darkest of times.